The December fog clung to London like a shroud when the urgent summons arrived from Westminster Abbey. A coffin prepared for burial in the hallowed crypt had been found empty on the very morning of the funeral, its lid pried open from within. And the body of Sir Charles Pemberton, prominent diplomat and advisor to the Crown, had vanished without trace. Inspector Lestrade stood at our door with an expression of profound bewilderment, clutching a telegram from the Dean of Westminster himself. Before I continue with this remarkable case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support allows us to keep bringing these mysteries to you. Now, let us proceed. Mr. Holmes, Lestrade began without preamble. I've investigated many strange cases in my career, but this one defies all rational explanation. A dead man has disappeared from his sealed coffin inside Westminster Abbey. The funeral is scheduled for this afternoon, and we have no body to bury. The scandal will be enormous if this becomes public knowledge. Holmes rose immediately, his grey eyes alight with interest. Tell me everything, Inspector. Leave out no detail, however insignificant it may seem. As our cab rattled through the fog-shrouded streets toward Westminster, Lestrade provided the essential facts. Sir Charles Pemberton had died 3 days earlier, apparently of natural causes, a heart seizure at age 63. He had been found in his study at home by his secretary, slumped over his desk with no signs of violence or struggle. His personal physician, Dr. Samuel Thornton, had certified the death and seen no reason to suspect anything other than cardiac failure. The body had been prepared for burial and placed in an ornate mahogany coffin 2 days prior. The coffin had been sealed and transported to Westminster Abbey, where Sir Charles was to receive the honor of burial in the crypt, among other distinguished servants of the Crown. The coffin had been placed in the chapel of St. Faith, under guard by Abbey vergers, pending the funeral ceremony scheduled for that very afternoon. And when was the disappearance discovered? Holmes asked. Early this morning, when the Dean himself went to pay final respects before the ceremony. He noticed the coffin lid was slightly displaced. When he investigated, he found the interior completely empty. No body, no burial shroud, nothing. The lid had been forced open from the inside, judging by the marks on the wood. From the inside? I exclaimed. But that's impossible. Sir Charles was dead. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. Precisely why this case is so disturbing, Doctor, Lestrade replied. Either we're dealing with someone who was buried alive by mistake, or something far more sinister has occurred. Westminster Abbey loomed before us through the fog, its Gothic architecture seeming even more forbidding in the grey morning light. The Dean met us at a side entrance, a dignified elderly clergyman whose usual composure was clearly shaken by recent events. Mr. Holmes, thank heaven you've come. This is a disaster of unprecedented proportions. Not only is the funeral this afternoon in jeopardy, but the very sanctity of the Abbey has been violated. How can a body simply disappear from within our walls? Holmes examined the chapel of St. Faith with meticulous attention. The mahogany coffin sat on a bier, its lid indeed displaced, and showing clear marks where it had been forced upward from within. Holmes studied these marks carefully with his magnifying glass. The pressure was applied from inside, certainly, but note the pattern of the scratches. They are too regular, too controlled. Someone inside the coffin used a tool, not bare fingers driven by panic. This was deliberate, not the desperate act of someone buried alive. He examined the interior of the coffin itself, paying particular attention to the silk lining and the bottom. Interesting. There are fiber traces here that do not match the burial shroud. Someone lay in this coffin who was wearing different clothing entirely. But how could anyone get inside after Sir Charles's body was placed there? The Dean asked, bewildered. They couldn't, Holmes replied, which means Sir Charles's body was never in this coffin at all. We are dealing with an elaborate substitution. The question is, when did it occur? And where is the real body? Over the next several hours, Holmes conducted a thorough investigation. He interviewed the undertakers who had prepared the body and sealed the coffin. He spoke with the vergers who had guarded the chapel. He examined the abbey's security and the routes by which the coffin had been transported from Sir Charles's residence. A pattern began to emerge. The undertaker's assistant, a young man named Thomas Bridges, who had helped prepare the body, had disappeared the previous evening and had not reported for work. His lodgings revealed he had packed hastily and left no forwarding address. More significantly, Holmes discovered that Bridges had only been employed by the funeral establishment for 6 weeks, just long enough to gain access to important burials, but not long enough for his employers to know much about his background. This was planned well in advance, Holmes concluded. Someone arranged for Bridges to be employed by this particular funeral establishment, knowing that Sir Charles's death would occur and that he would be buried at Westminster. But Holmes, I objected, how could anyone know when Sir Charles would die? Are you suggesting his death was not natural? I'm suggesting we need to speak with Dr. Thornton immediately. And we need to locate Sir Charles's actual body before the funeral this afternoon. Or we'll have a scandal that will rock the foundations of government. Dr. Samuel Thornton received us at his Harley Street practice with obvious reluctance. He was a distinguished physician of perhaps 50 years, with an excellent reputation and a practice that included many prominent clients. Holmes's questions were direct and unrelenting. Dr. Thornton, describe Sir Charles's condition in his final weeks. Was he ill? Had he complained of any symptoms? Sir Charles had been under considerable stress lately. He mentioned fatigue, occasional palpitations. Nothing that suggested imminent danger. But at his age, such symptoms warrant attention. I advised rest and less strenuous activity. Did you perform any tests? Take any samples? I examined him thoroughly 2 weeks ago. His heart showed some irregularity, but nothing alarming for a man of his age and habits. And when you certified his death, you were certain it was cardiac failure. Dr. Thornton hesitated. The symptoms were consistent with heart attack. He was found slumped at his desk, no pulse, no respiration. What else should I have suspected? Holmes leaned forward intently. Did you notice anything unusual about the body? Any marks, discolorations, signs of recent medical procedures? There was a small puncture mark on his left arm. I assumed it was from a blood sampling I had performed the previous week. It was in the same location. Was it? Exactly the same location, or merely similar? The doctor frowned, clearly troubled. Now that you mention it, the mark seemed slightly different. More recent, perhaps. But I attributed it to the natural changes that occur after death. Holmes stood abruptly. Doctor, I believe Sir Charles Pemberton was murdered, and his body stolen to prevent discovery of the method. Someone administered a substance that mimicked cardiac failure, then arranged to substitute themselves in the coffin to complete the theft of the body. We need to find where that body was taken before all evidence of the crime is destroyed. The investigation now moved with urgent speed. Holmes's network of street informants spread throughout London, searching for any sign of unusual activity involving transport of a body or coffin. Meanwhile, Holmes examined Sir Charles's personal papers and correspondence, looking for anything that might suggest motive for murder. What emerged was troubling. Sir Charles had been investigating corruption in certain government contracts related to military supplies. His notes suggested he had uncovered a conspiracy involving several prominent businessmen who were selling defective equipment to the army at inflated prices. Sir Charles had planned to present his findings to Parliament the week following his death. "Here is our motive," Holmes said, showing me the documents. Sir Charles's investigation threatened to expose people with both wealth and connections. His death eliminates the primary witness, and the theft of his body prevents any medical examination that might reveal poisoning. But surely his notes are sufficient evidence, I suggested. Notes can be dismissed as speculation unless supported by credible testimony. A dead witness cannot testify, Watson. And if the body is destroyed, there can be no posthumous examination to confirm poisoning. The conspirators have been thorough in their planning. Late that afternoon, word came from one of Holmes's informants. A private warehouse near the Thames had been rented 3 weeks earlier by a man matching the description of Thomas Bridges. The warehouse had been observed receiving a delivery the previous night. A wooden crate of approximately coffin dimensions, transported with unusual care. We arrived at the warehouse with Inspector Lestrade and several constables just as dusk was falling. The building was locked, but Holmes made short work of the padlock. Inside we found a macabre scene. A makeshift laboratory with chemical equipment, and in the center, an open coffin containing the body of Sir Charles Pemberton. But the body had already been partially dissected. Someone with medical knowledge had been removing organs, clearly attempting to destroy evidence of poisoning before the tissues could be properly analyzed. The work had been interrupted. Tools lay scattered, and chemical solutions sat unfinished. They knew we were coming, Holmes said grimly. Someone warned them and they fled, but they left us something valuable. He pointed to a drawer that had been hastily emptied. Inside were traces of a fine white powder. Holmes collected a sample carefully. This will require analysis, but I suspect we'll find it's a rare alkaloid poison that can mimic cardiac symptoms. Over the next several days, the case unfolded systematically. The powder proved to be a derivative of oleander toxin, obtainable only through specialized chemical suppliers. Records from such suppliers revealed that Thomas Bridges, or rather the man using that name, had purchased the substance 6 weeks earlier under false credentials. More importantly, Holmes traced the financial trail behind the conspiracy. The warehouse had been rented using funds from a company that proved to be a front for one of the businessmen Sir Charles had been investigating, Marcus Thornwood, a prominent military contractor whose defective rifles had caused casualties among British troops. Confronted with the evidence and facing the prospect of execution for murder as well as fraud and corruption, Thornwood confessed. He had hired a professional criminal named James Hackett to eliminate Sir Charles before his investigation could be completed. Hackett, who had medical training from his years as an army medical orderly, had administered the oleander poison to Sir Charles during what appeared to be a routine visit to discuss military contracts. The poison had worked as intended, causing rapid cardiac arrest that appeared natural. Hackett, posing as Thomas Bridges, had then arranged to substitute himself in the coffin at the undertaker's establishment, using his knowledge of funeral procedures to execute the swap without detection. Once the coffin reached Westminster Abbey, he had simply opened it from within using tools he had concealed, removed Sir Charles's body to the waiting warehouse, and disappeared into the night. The plan had been to completely destroy all evidence of poisoning before anyone suspected murder, then dispose of the body entirely. The funeral would proceed with an empty coffin, which would be sealed and buried, with no one the wiser. By the time Sir Charles's notes were discovered and investigated, weeks or months would have passed, and any connection to Thornwood would be impossible to prove. But they made one critical error, Holmes explained as we reviewed the case at Baker Street after the arrests had been made. They assumed no one would notice the body's disappearance before the burial was complete. They didn't account for the Dean's custom of paying final respects on the morning of the funeral. That discovery forced them to flee before destroying all the evidence. The funeral for Sir Charles Pemberton finally took place a week later, with his body properly examined by the Home Office pathologist, who confirmed the presence of oleander poisoning. The ceremony was somber, made more so by the knowledge of the extraordinary conspiracy that had preceded it. Marcus Thornwood and James Hackett both faced trial for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming, and both were convicted. Thornwood received life imprisonment, his fortune seized to compensate the families of soldiers killed by his defective equipment. Hackett was sentenced to death, though this was later commuted to life imprisonment due to questions about his mental state. The broader conspiracy was exposed, leading to investigations that reached high into government circles and resulted in sweeping reforms of military procurement processes. Sir Charles's investigation, which had seemed destined to die with him, instead became the foundation for changes that saved countless lives. A satisfactory conclusion, Holmes remarked as he filed away his notes on the case. Justice served, corruption exposed, and reforms implemented. Sir Charles achieved in death what he had sought to accomplish in life. Yet it came at such a cost, I observed. A good man murdered, his body stolen and desecrated, all to protect the profits of criminals. Indeed. But consider, Watson. Had they simply accepted Sir Charles's investigation and cooperated with it, the consequences would have been far less severe. Financial penalties, perhaps some prison time, but nothing compared to what they now face. Crime compounds itself, and what begins as simple fraud escalates to murder and beyond. They sealed their own doom the moment they decided that killing was preferable to accountability. The case had one final, unexpected development. The real Thomas Bridges, whose identity had been stolen by James Hackett, was found alive in Liverpool, where he had been working as a carpenter's apprentice for the past 2 years. He had been unaware that someone was using his name and credentials in London. The undertaker who had unknowingly hired Hackett established new protocols for verifying the backgrounds of all employees. Westminster Abbey itself instituted new security measures for burials, ensuring that no coffin would ever again sit unguarded within its walls. The chapel of St. Faith, where the empty coffin had been discovered, became a destination for those interested in the curious case, though the dean discouraged such morbid tourism. For Holmes, the case represented one of his most complex investigations into the intersection of murder, political corruption, and elaborate deception. He had unraveled a conspiracy that stretched from the halls of government to the sacred crypts of Westminster, proving that even the most carefully planned crimes left traces that skilled observation could detect. As I completed my notes on the case several weeks later, I reflected on the symbolic significance of an empty coffin in Westminster Abbey. It had been intended as the final stage of a perfect crime, a burial with no body, concealing murder as natural death. Instead, it had become the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy, exposing not just the murder of one man, but the corruption that had endangered thousands. The empty coffin had told a story of absence, of a body that should have been present but was not, of justice that was nearly denied but was ultimately served, of truth that had been hidden but was finally revealed. It was, I thought, a fitting metaphor for Holmes's work itself, finding meaning in what was missing, seeing significance in what others overlooked, and bringing to light what criminals had tried desperately to keep in darkness. Holmes kept among his mementos a small splinter of wood from the coffin lid, marked with the scratches from where it had been forced open from within. When I asked him why he retained such a grim souvenir, he simply smiled. To remind me, Watson, that things are not always as they seem. An empty coffin in a sacred place, far from being a supernatural mystery, proved to be evidence of very human crimes: murder, greed, and corruption. It serves as a reminder to look past the superficial and seek the truth that lies beneath. The case of the empty coffin at Westminster remained one of the most sensational investigations of Holmes's career, combining elements of locked-room mystery, political intrigue, medical knowledge, and elaborate criminal conspiracy. It demonstrated once again that his methods, careful observation, logical deduction, and refusal to accept the obvious explanation, could solve even cases that seemed to defy natural law. In the years that followed, the reforms prompted by Sir Charles's investigation and the subsequent exposure of military procurement corruption saved countless lives among British soldiers serving throughout the Empire. It was a legacy far more meaningful than any monument in Westminster Abbey could ever be. A living testament to one man's dedication to justice, and to the detective who ensured his death was not in vain. And so the empty coffin, which had once threatened to conceal the truth forever, instead became the instrument by which truth triumphed. Sir Charles Pemberton found final rest in the crypt of Westminster Abbey, and his killers found justice in the courts of England. The conspiracy that had sought to profit from death discovered instead that death brings its own reckoning, and that some crimes, no matter how carefully planned, cannot escape the scrutiny of Sherlock Holmes.